Imagine, if you will, being an Arab Bedouin, like centuries ago.
Right.
You are riding a camel across this lonely, just endless desert. The landscape is vast, unforgiving, and completely silent. Well, except for one sound.
The camel's hooves.
Exactly. The rhythmic beating of the camel's padded hooves on the soft, shifting sand. Just a constant, steady tempo. Now, put yourself in that headspace. You are so sunk deep in your own recollections, so isolated in this immense empty space, that this physical rhythm completely takes hold of your mind.
Yeah, you can't help it.
Right. You subconsciously start chanting in unison with the movement of the animal beneath you. It's just a simple, repetitive vocalization at first, something to, beguile the time, something to quicken the beast under the hot sun.
Just a completely natural human response to the environment.
Exactly. And you don't know it yet, but that specific rhythm, that highly physical bodily response to your harsh environment, is about to become the foundational architecture of an entire literary civilization.
It really is wild to think about.
It is. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are exploring a massive stack of historical sources regarding the history of Muslim philosophy, and we're specifically focusing on the incredible, often turbulent evolution of Arabic and Persian literature, grammar, and literary criticism.
And it's a huge topic.
Huge. Our mission today is to trace how a survivalist desert culture birthed a rigidly perfect poetic tradition, how a new world religion completely upended it, and how the resulting clash of empires forced humanity to, literally invent the science of grammar just to hold their world together.
Yeah, it is a phenomenal trajectory to track. I mean, we were looking at a linguistic evolution that spans continents. It fundamentally altered how millions of people conceptualize the reality.
And as always, you're here to help us decode all this. We're also going to see how the Persian language absorbed these massive cultural shockwaves to create some of the most profound, mystical, and epic poetry in human history.
Right. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we aren't just looking at old poems or dusty lexicons today.
No, not at all.
We are examining how humanity organizes its thoughts under extreme pressure. We are looking at how a people defends its identity, how it adapts to unprecedented social upheaval, and ultimately how the mechanics of language mirror the human mind trying to make sense of the universe.
I love that framework. So let's go right back to that desert scene we started with, that camel rider chanting in the silence.
The origins.
Right. Our sources point out that this unsophisticated outpouring of the rider's heart took a specific form called rajaz. And the text describes it as a simple iambic rhythm that literally mirrored the lifting and lowering of a camel's feet.
Yeah, the physical environment didn't just, influence the art. It entirely dictated the form of the art.
Oh.
The rajaz is essentially the heartbeat of early Arabic poetry. The rhythmic sway of the camel is literally encoded into the syllable structure.
So it starts as a tool.
Exactly. What began as a utilitarian practice, a work song, effectively, to keep the rider awake and the animal moving at a steady pace, eventually evolved into an incredibly complex, highly regulated art form.
The environment creating the beat makes total sense to me. It reminds me of how modern musical genres are born from the environmental sounds around us.
Well, absolutely.
Think about industrial techno music coming out of Detroit or Berlin, where the genre literally mirrors the mechanical, repetitive, aggressive thumping of assembly lines and factory machinery. The environment provides the metronome.
That's a great comparison.
But what I find fascinating is how this camel rhythm didn't just stay a folk song. It became a mathematical science.
No, it became fiercely codified. Centuries later, in the 8th century, a brilliant linguistic scholar named Al-Khalil would actually categorize 16 distinct metrical forms of this poetry. 16. He reduced this vast oral tradition into a quantifiable mathematical system of prosody.
Okay, so I was reading about Al-Khalil in the notes, and I need you to confirm this because it sounds almost like a myth. Did he really figure out the mathematical meters of Arabic poetry by listening to a blacksmith?
He did. The sources explicitly mention this. Al-Khalil was inspired by the rhythmic rebound of a smith's hammer on an anvil.
That is insane.
Right. He listened to the differing tones on the rebound. So you have the heavy strike followed by the lighter bounce. And he realized that this auditory pattern of heavy and light strikes perfectly mapped onto the long and short syllables of Arabic poetry.
So the clang of the blacksmith's hammer is structurally akin to the camel's tread.
Exactly. He used that physical auditory reality to build the theoretical framework for all Arabic meter.
That is just brilliant observation. But let's look at the people actually using these meters back in the beginning. During the Jahiliyyah, which our sources translate as the Age of Ignorance, the period before Islam, what was the poet actually doing?
That's a crucial question.
Because when I think of a poet, I picture someone sitting quietly under a tree, contemplating a flower. But these sources paint a wildly different picture of the pre-Islamic era poet.
Oh, yeah. A poet in pre-Islamic Arabian society was far from a solitary romantic. They occupied a position of immense, terrifying power. Yes, because they were believed to be in direct communion with supernatural forces, like a jinni or a spirit that literally fed them their verses.
Oh, wow. So they were almost like shamans.
Sort of, but their everyday function was entirely practical, deeply political, and fiercely communal. They were the PR machines, the defense attorneys, and the psychological weapons for their respective tribes.
A psychological weapon. That really shifts the perspective. So if my tribe is about to go to war with your tribe, our poets are essentially our artillery.
Quite literally, yes. In a society with no overarching state, no police force, and no civic law, survival depended entirely on tribal solidarity, and that was based exclusively on blood kinship.
Right. Us versus them.
Exactly. So the poet's job was to commemorate the glories of their own tribe, exalt their achievements in battle, and utterly humiliate and demoralize their rivals. The keynote of this entire body of poetry was a concept called Hamas.
And the sources define Hamas as unbridled aggression and bravery. Right?
Yes. It is a desperate, existential pursuit of martial glory. It is the glorification of vengeance, the boasting of physical prowess, and the fierce defense of the tribe's honor.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the vehicle they use for all this aggression and tribal boasting was a very specific, incredibly rigid poetic structure called the qasida, or the ode.
The qasida, yes.
And the sources break down the qasida into a strict three-part formula. And apparently, every single poet had to follow this exact formula. So let's walk through the anatomy of this thing, because it tells us so much about their psychology. Part one is called the nasib.
Right. The nasib is the romantic prelude. The traditional opening requires the poet to picture himself, often accompanied by a couple of companions, suddenly halting his camel.
Because he sees something.
Yes, because he has stumbled upon the remains of an abandoned encampment where his beloved used to live.
It's a very cinematic opening. You're riding along, you see the blackened stones of an old campfire in the sand,
Yeah.
and it just hits you with this wave of nostalgia.
Well, the nomadic lifestyle meant that tribes were constantly on the move, chasing seasonal rainfall. So finding the physical remnants of a past encampment would trigger an intense, melancholic realization of loss and the relentless passage of time.
That makes a lot of sense.
The poet uses this setting to launch into a passionate description of the woman he loved and lost when her tribe moved on.
And the descriptions of the beloved in this nasib section are wildly specific. Like, the text notes how the Arab mind at this time focused very discreetly on individual parts of the body, rather than, like, abstract ideas of beauty.
Very grounded in the physical.
Yeah. There are two comparisons from the sources that just stuck with me. First, to convey the sweetness of a kiss, a poet compared the beloved's saliva to early morning rain collected in a clear, stony pond.
Oh.
I know. And they would describe drinking this nectar with the frantic zest of a drunkard.
It is highly evocative, sensuous imagery, but you have to remember the context of the desert environment here.
Right, the lack of water.
Exactly. Water is the most precious, life-giving resource imaginable. To compare a lover's kiss to untouched, pristine morning rain gathered in clean stone is the highest possible elevation of that physical experience.
Oh, that completely reframes it for me. And the second comparison, the ideal standard of female beauty was described as a woman sheltered from the harsh weather, like the delicate shell of an egg under the feathers.
Again, environment dictates aesthetics.
Right.
In a landscape defined by harsh winds, blistering sun, and grueling physical labor, a life completely protected from the elements was the ultimate, unimaginable luxury.
So to be soft and sheltered was the ultimate flex.
Exactly. That delicacy, that total sheltering from the harsh realities of the desert became the absolute standard of beauty. But we must remember, the nasib, this deeply romantic, melancholic prelude, was essentially a rhetorical trick.
A trick? You mean they didn't really care about the girl?
Well, the poet's feelings of love were certainly real, but in the context of the qasida, the romantic opening served a structural purpose. It was a hook.
Ah, to grab the audience.
Yes. The poet expresses his heartache, perhaps comparing his sorrow to a she-camel who has lost her young, which immediately grabs the emotional attention of the listeners around the fire.
They can relate to that.
Exactly. Once the audience is captivated by this shared human experience of lost love, the poet executes a sharp pivot to the real agenda.
Which brings us to part 2, the Maidi, or the eulogy. This is the absolute core of the poem. The romance is over, and now it's time for the tribal propaganda.
The main event.
Right. This is where the boasting takes center stage. The poet goes on for verses and verses about how his tribe fights the hardest, rides the fastest horses, and interestingly gives away the most food to their guests.
Yes. Hospitality was just as crucial to their honor system as martial prowess.
Really, giving away food was equal to fighting.
Absolutely. In a deadly environment, extreme generosity to guests is a survival mechanism that becomes elevated to a moral absolute.
If I don't feed you today, you might not feed me tomorrow when I'm starving.
Exactly. The Mahdi was designed to inflate the collective ego of the tribe to towering heights while simultaneously tearing down the reputation of any enemy tribe.
And then they wrap it all up with part 3, the Khatima, or the epilogue. The sources say this was usually a didactic conclusion where the poet offers some collected wisdom from his life.
Some parting thoughts.
Yeah, but what struck me was how bleak this wisdom was. The sources emphasized that it reflected a stark hedonistic view of life. There is no deep religious reflection, no hope for spiritual salvation.
No, religion in any organized dogmatic sense sat very lightly on the pagan Arab.
Like they just didn't care.
The concept of submission to a supreme moral power or a belief in a life after death that involved moral retribution was largely absent from their worldview.
The text mentions there were a few pockets of Jewish, Christian, or Hanif influence in oasis towns, but for the vast majority of the Bedouin, death was just the end, right?
Exactly. Death is a stark, inescapable fact that will come for you eventually. Therefore, the wisdom of the Khatima was entirely practical and fiercely worldly.
Just live for today.
Precisely. Since you cannot avoid death, you must be incredibly brave in battle to secure your legacy, and you must be extravagantly hedonistic in times of peace to enjoy what little time you have.
But I have to stop here and push back on this whole format.
Okay, go ahead.
Because when you look at the mechanics of the qasida, it is one single meter running through the entire poem. It is one continuous rhyme running through the entire poem.
Yes.
And it's the exact same 3-part structure. The campfires, the boasting, the fatalism, every single time. From a modern perspective, does this not sound incredibly stifling for an artist? Wasn't it just a repetitive, boring formula?
Well, it is entirely understandable why a modern sensibility which prizes constant novelty and individual subversion of form would view the qasida as a straitjacket.
Right, we want artists to break the rules.
But we have to understand the psychological reality of their existence. This rigid, unchanging literary form perfectly mirrored their physical and social reality.
How so?
The Bedouin lived a life defined by severe limitations and very little variety. The stark, unchanging monotony of the desert landscape, combined with the totalitarian, absolute demands of tribal loyalty, left absolutely no room for highly individualized, eccentric experimentation.
So the lack of variety in their physical life translated directly to a lack of structural variety in their art.
Yes. The strict structure gave them a necessary, reliable framework to make sense of a chaotic world. The rigidity was a comfort, not a constraint.
That is fascinating.
And if we look specifically at that continuous rhyme you mentioned, the kafia, which is the Arabic term for the rhyming syllable at the end of every single line, it was not an artificial add-on.
It wasn't just to make it sound pretty.
No, it wasn't a decorative flourish painted onto the end of a sentence just to make it sound nice. The ancient critics understood that the kafia was deeply structural. As the text explicitly notes, it laid the rails for thought.
Laid the rails for thought.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, the great ancient literary critics defined a true-born poet as someone who could indicate the end of a verse, the exact specific rhyme in the very first opening word of the line.
Wait, so you're saying the poet starts speaking and the audience already knows how the sentence is going to end?
Yes. Because the grammatical rules of Arabic are so highly structured and the thematic trajectory of the qasida is so well understood, the poet sets the trajectory with the first few words.
That is wild.
The qafiyya is strictly adhered to, so the audience's imagination is forced to rush ahead down those rails. They guess the rhyming word before the poet even speaks it aloud.
Oh, that completely changes how I view it. It's not just a guy reciting a monologue at people, it's an interactive puzzle.
Exactly.
The audience is participating in the creation of the poem in real time.
It creates a thrilling, electrifying communion between the poet and the tribe. When the poet finally lands on that expected rhyme, it produces a collective burst of psychological satisfaction.
Like a beat drop in a song today.
Precisely. It reinforces their shared identity and shared understanding of the world.
Okay, so we have this incredibly tight-knit culture built entirely on tribal boasting, blood feuds, and rigid communal poetry. But what happens to a culture built entirely on these specific values when they are suddenly, violently introduced to a universal moral code?
Everything changes.
Because that is exactly what happens next. A new religion emerges in the Arabian Peninsula, and it fundamentally disrupts this entire literary and social ecosystem.
Islam pulled the rug out from under the poets, completely and fundamentally.
How bad was the disruption?
Think about everything we just discussed. The primary engines of pre-Islamic poetry were aggressive self-glorification, blood vengeance, and tearing down rival tribes. Islam arrived and systematically dismantled those engines.
Because those values clash with a universal religion.
Exactly. It outlawed blind tribal partisanship. It demanded absolute equality under a universal divine law. It made the kind of satirical, honor-destroying poetry the poets specialized in a punishable libel.
It's a massive cultural shock. Suddenly, the very fuel that powered the Qasida was banned. And I want to be very careful here to frame this properly based on our sources.
Right.
Looking strictly at the historical accounts provided in these texts, we see a fierce propaganda war erupt. The historical fact is that many of these entrenched poets vehemently opposed the Prophet Muhammad.
They did. The poets recognized immediately that their supremacy was threatened, not just politically, but culturally and artistically.
They were losing their jobs, essentially.
And their status. They used their art, their psychological weapons, as we called them earlier, to incite opposition against the new religious movement.
And because of the danger of this poetic propaganda in a society that relied so heavily on oral transmission, our sources note that it led to severe penalties for some of those poets who used their verses to incite violence or libel the new community.
The clash was inevitable. The poets were defending an entire worldview based on the exaltation of human force and tribal supremacy.
But it wasn't just a political battle, was it?
No. What truly shook the poets wasn't just the political threat. They were suddenly confronted with a text that they simply could not categorize or defeat on literary terms.
The Qur'an.
Yes, the Qur'an.
The sources make it clear that the Arabs were absolutely bewildered by the Qur'an. They were the masters of language. But this text broke all their rules.
It broke every rule they had.
It wasn't poetry, it didn't follow Al-Khalil's mathematical meters, and it didn't use the continuous kafiya rhyme, but it also wasn't the rhythmic babble of a kahin, which was the term for a pagan soothsayer or fortune teller.
Right. The Qur'an introduced a completely new prototype of prose to the Arabic language.
How was it structured?
It utilized short, intensely compact sentences with a highly distinguishable rhythmic cadence at the end of phrases. This cadence is known as fazl.
And how is fazl different from the rhyme they were used to?
Well, it was entirely free from the predictable shackles of regular rhyme, which was called saj.
Okay, so it had rhythm, but not a predictable rhyme.
Right. It had a profound musicality, but it refused to be locked into the strict, unbroken patterns of the qasida. It was fluid, authoritative, and utterly alien to their established traditions.
But the bewilderment wasn't just about the formatting of the sentences, right? The actual content was doing something their brains weren't used to processing.
What's fascinating here is that the structural uniqueness of the Qur'an was deeply tied to a massive cognitive shift in its content.
A cognitive shift.
Yes. Pre-Islamic poetry, as we saw in the Nasib, was heavily focused on the aesthetic worship of nature, the sensuous descriptions of the desert, the water, the camel.
Right, the early morning rain and the eggshells.
Exactly. The Qur'an shifted the Arab mind away from mere physical description and toward moral reasoning. It introduced the search for an ideal goal in human conduct.
So it's asking, why are we here, instead of just look at this campfire?
Precisely. It forced a transition away from primary, selfish impulses and blood kinship, pushing the listener toward the concept of universal brotherhood governed by strict divine limits.
That's a huge leap for that society.
It was. This unparalleled synthesis of elegant, entirely novel form with profound moral content essentially birthed Arabic prose as a high art form. It was a literary challenge the pagan poets simply couldn't meet using their old tools.
But poetry itself didn't die out. I was reading the notes on this transition period, and I was actually surprised to learn that the prophet patronized poets who were willing to adapt to this new moral paradigm.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a really famous story in our sources about a poet named Kabi Zuhair.
Kabi Zuhair's story perfectly illustrates this transition.
Right, so our sources say he was a poet who initially opposed the new religion, but eventually came to seek pardon. He stood up and recited a poem that was so well received it won him a tremendous prize, the prophet's own mantle, the burda.
A massive honor.
But here's a detail that blew my mind. The poem that won this ultimate religious approval still opened with traditional erotic verses.
It did.
He lamented his separation from his beloved Suad, and even compared her saliva to wine, which was a classic pre-Islamic trope. How was that allowed?
It is a crucial point regarding the evolution of the culture. Islam did not taboo poetry as a medium, nor did it attempt to taboo basic human nature.
Interesting.
The Orthodox Islamic standard demanded a shift in ultimate values, not the erasure of art. Kabi Zuhair intentionally kept the nasib, the romantic, sensuous prelude, because it was aesthetically pleasing and spoke to a universal human experience.
So he hooks them with the old tricks.
Exactly. But the crucial shift happens in the Madi, the core of the poem.
Ah, where the boasting used to be.
Right. Instead of launching into a boastful tirade about his tribe's bloodlust and superiority, he replaced the exaltation of brute force with the glorification of the new religious ideal.
So he praises the new community instead of his tribe.
He praised the moral character and the mission of the new community. Eroticism and wine imagery were allowed to survive, but they began to transition into literary symbols, provided they didn't actively promote sinful action or boast about literal lewdness.
So the vessel remains exactly the same, but the liquid they pour inside it completely changes. The structure survives, but the meaning evolves.
That's a great way to put it.
Which leads us perfectly into the next massive shift. As the Islamic Empire rapidly expands out of the Arabian Peninsula, conquering the Sassanid Persian Empire and massive chunks of the Byzantine Empire, it settles into new, incredibly wealthy urban centers.
A completely new world.
Yeah, we're moving into the Umayyad and Abbasid eras. The harsh, starving desert gives way to immense wealth, leisure time, and a chaotic melting pot of Persian, Greek, Syrian, and Arab cultures.
The socio-political landscape was transformed beyond recognition, and naturally the poetry underwent a drastic mutation to reflect this new reality.
What did that look like?
Well, during the Umayyad period, the center of gravity shifted. You had a significant population of very wealthy, intelligent Arab youths living in cities like Mecca and Medina.
Okay.
But due to the shifting political power to Damascus, many of these youths were essentially sidelined from politics or military command.
So they have vast fortunes, no jobs, and endless leisure time. This sounds like a recipe for trouble.
They turned their immense creative genius away from statecraft and toward art, amusement, and high society.
And this is where the poetry physically fractures. That romantic prelude, the nasib, which used to just be the quick appetizer, the old qasida, finally breaks completely off and becomes its own independent, standalone genre.
Yes, it becomes the ghazal.
The ghazal, or love poetry. And our sources note a fascinating sociological split here. The ghazal diverged into two completely distinct, parallel tracks based on where the poet lived.
The urban versus the desert.
Exactly. First, you have the licentious, highly flirtatious poetry of the wealthy town youths. The prime example in our text is Umar bi Abi Rabia. These guys were basically the ancient equivalent of trust fund playboys.
It was a complete shift in the poet's persona. The poet was no longer a hardened desert warrior snatching a brief melancholic moment to dream of a lost woman.
Now he's just trying to get a date.
He was now an amorous, wealthy youth entirely devoted to dalliance and pursuit.
The sources mention that these poets would literally use the Hajj congregation, the massive, solemn annual pilgrimage to Mecca, as a social mixer.
That's true.
They would use the crowds to spot beautiful women from far-flung provinces who had traveled for the pilgrimage. That is so brazen.
The focus of the poetry moved completely inward. It transformed the idea of romantic union from a desperate, tragic loss in the desert into a witty, sophisticated exchange of feeling and sentiment. It was marked by sharp dialogue, psychological games, and sport.
But then you have the complete opposite happening at the exact same time. The parallel track is the platonic, intensely chaste love poetry coming out of the desert tribes.
Yes.
This is where we get the legendary tragic stories of Majnun and Layla.
The contrast is breathtaking. This ideal conception of love, a love entirely shorn of bodily lust, focused purely on spiritual devotion to the beloved, was completely unknown to the pre-Islamic Arab.
Right, because the pagan Arab was pragmatic.
Highly pragmatic.
So where did this extreme chastity come from?
It was the chastening influence of Islamic moral restraints, combined with the lingering harshness of desert life, that birthed this highly subjective, deeply pathetic poetry.
Pathetic, meaning full of pathos, like emotional suffering.
Exactly. In this desert ghazal, even a touch of physical lust was viewed as a desecration of the purity of love. The poet is consumed by an unattainable ideal.
So you have the urbanites exploring the psychology of flirtation and hookups, and the desert poets exploring the spiritual agony of pure, unattainable love.
Two very different reactions to the same cultural shift.
But human nature never changes, and there's a detail from the text that I absolutely have to bring up. Because as soon as love poetry became popular, people started weaponizing it.
Poetry never truly lost its function as a social weapon. The ammunition just changed.
Exactly. If you wanted to ruin a rival's political reputation in this new urban society, you didn't write a poem about how bad they were at sword fighting. You wrote a fake, scandalous love poem about their sister or their wife.
It was devastatingly effective.
And there is this amazing, vivid anecdote in our sources about a high-class lady named Jafar. She was furious about this tactic.
She confronted a poet named Alawaz right in the middle of a crowded marketplace.
Yes, she walks up to him in public and aggressively demands money from him, pretending he owes her a massive debt.
And he's totally blindsided.
Alawaz is completely confused. He swears he doesn't owe her money and says he doesn't even know who she is. And Jafar brilliantly replies, "Of course you do not know me, yet you mention many things about me in your verses."
It's such a great moment.
He was just writing fake, scandalous love poems about her to smear her family's political standing, having never even met her. She totally called him out.
It perfectly highlights how potent poetry remained in the public sphere. It was the mass media of the day.
Yeah, you could ruin someone's life with a rhyme.
But as the empire evolved and the capital moved from Damascus to Baghdad under the Abbasid dynasty, the culture shifted yet again, becoming even more complex and volatile.
Baghdad was huge.
Baghdad was a cosmopolitan metropolis, and it became a cauldron of Persian and Arab rivalries.
The Abbasids had heavily relied on Persian support to overthrow the Umayyads, so suddenly Persian intellectuals and administrators are in positions of immense power. And this demographic shift births a very specific, provocative subculture in Baghdad, the Bohemians.
Yes. The sources refer to these Persian intellectuals occasionally as zindiqs.
What does that mean?
It was a loaded term, often denoting heretics, free thinkers, or those secretly clinging to pre-Islamic Persian religions like Manichaeism. These intellectuals formed highly exclusive clubs in Baghdad.
And what were they doing in these clubs? Because the sources say they were flaunting their cultural refinement through wine, women, and highly sarcastic poetry that explicitly mocked the orthodox, simple Arab way of life. We're talking about famous poets like Abu Nuwas and Bashar.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this bohemianism wasn't just about seeking pleasure or throwing wild parties.
Right.
It was a calculated, deeply cynical demonstration of intellectual arrogance and political rebellion. It was a mechanism for the conquered Persian elite to assert their inherent cultural superiority over their Arab conquerors.
So drinking wine and writing poems about it was a political statement.
Absolutely. They were effectively saying, we possess a more ancient, highly refined civilization, and we refuse to be bound by your simplistic desert austerities. Abu Nuwas famously stated that he could talk of fire without burning his mouth.
Meaning he could write exquisite, detailed poetry about wine and debauchery purely as a mental exercise, an artistic performance, without necessarily believing in it or being ruined by it. It's art for art's sake.
It was a massive intellectual flex.
Oh.
But this political rebellion, disguised as hedonism, was playing with fire.
They pushed it too far.
The Abbasid rulers grew increasingly suspicious of the political aspirations of these Persian intellectuals. They realized the poetry was subversive.
And it backfired terribly.
It culminated in a methodical zindiq hunt. The state cracked down. Verses of poetry were literally brought into courtrooms and intellectually dissected at trials to prove treason or religious heresy, which frequently led to execution.
Executed for a poem.
It was a deadly game of cultural brinkmanship played out through metaphors and meter.
Okay, so that covers the high poetry of the elite courts, the playboys, and the subversive intellectual clubs. But a question naturally arises. How were everyday, normal people entertained?
Commoners, yeah.
This brings us to the rise of prose and fiction. And the historical reality here completely surprised me. We all know the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights.
Of course.
It's globally famous, probably the most recognizable piece of Middle Eastern literature in the West. But according to our sources, cultured Arab scholars of the time absolutely hated pure fiction.
They despised it.
Why?
Well, to understand why, you have to put yourself in the shoes of an Islamic scholar of the Abbasid era. Their entire intellectual framework, their entire academic training was rooted in the rigorous, exhaustive preservation of religious texts and historical truth. They invented complex sciences, like the science of hadith transmitters, just to verify the absolute historical authenticity of a single quote from the prophet.
So for a scholar whose entire life is dedicated to sorting verifiable truth from falsehood, someone sitting down and just making up a story about a flying carpet seems
I think
childish.
worse than childish. It was viewed as dangerous.
Dangerous.
They feared that indulging in pure fiction stories that were explicitly untrue would eventually erode the public's ability to discern historical and religious facts. Falsehood, even for entertainment, was seen as intellectually corrosive.
So the 1001 Nights, which the sources note was heavily based on an older Persian collection called the Hazar Afsana, was never considered high literature.
Never.
It was relegated to the common people in the dusky marketplaces. It was told by anonymous street performers to amuse the uneducated masses. No self-respecting scholar would admit to reading it.
Never. The term for high literature was adab, and pure fiction did not qualify as adab.
So what did qualify as good prose?
If a high-status scholar was going to read or write prose, it had to serve a dual purpose. It either had to deliver a profound moral import, or it had to demonstrate immense, undeniable linguistic skill.
And the sources give us examples of both. For moral import, high-class prose was reserved for things like Kalila wa Dimna.
Yes, the fables.
These were moral fables featuring talking animals, translated from ancient Sanskrit and Pahlavi, which was Middle Persian. But they weren't just stories for kids, right? They were essentially political science manuals, intended to teach conduct and strategy to kings and high-level administrators.
It was practical wisdom clothed in narrative. But the other acceptable form of prose is perhaps even more fascinating because it focuses entirely on linguistic gymnastics.
You're talking about the makama.
Yes.
This concept is so funny to me. The text describes it as a picaresque romance. Basically, it's a story about a witty, roving beggar who travels from town to town, getting into various situations and talking his way out of them. But the plot of the makama is completely irrelevant, isn't it?
The narrative is merely a vehicle. The entire point of writing a makama was to provide a loose episodic framework for a scholar to show off his incredibly massive vocabulary.
It's like a battle rap, but for dictionary nerds.
That's pretty accurate, actually.
The author would use the voice of this roving beggar to string together the most obscure words, the most complex grammatical structures, and the most difficult rhymes possible. It's writing a novel just to prove you swallowed a thesaurus.
It perfectly illustrates the linguistic obsession of the era. The form, the vocabulary, the mastery of the Arabic language were paramount. The actual narrative was just a display case for the words.
Which naturally brings us to a massive logistical nightmare. We have this explosion of poetry, prose, and intellectual debate happening in cosmopolitan Baghdad. But the empire is unimaginably huge.
Huge and diverse.
You have native Persians, Greeks, Syrians, and Copts in Egypt, all trying to participate in this Arabic literary renaissance, because Arabic is the language of government, law, and religion. If you have all these non-native speakers using the language, how do you stop Arabic from fracturing into a million mutually unintelligible dialects?
The empire faced a severe linguistic crisis. It was a phenomenon the scholar called alan, which translates to incorrect speech or gross mispronunciation.
Because the alphabet was tricky, right?
Exactly. Because the Arabic script at that early time only recorded consonants. There were no written marks for the short vowels. Non-native speakers were frequently mispronouncing words.
And this wasn't just a matter of having a bad accent, right? This had massive religious implications.
It was an existential threat. They were mispronouncing the Qur'an.
Oh.
To the Muslims, the Qur'an is the literal exact word of God. To mispronounce it, to alter a vowel that changes the grammatical meaning of a divine sentence, was viewed as a horrific, unacceptable distortion of the sacred text.
So they couldn't just let the language evolve naturally like English or French did. They had to literally invent the science of grammar as an emergency intervention to freeze the language in place.
Yes, to save the religion.
Enter a man named Abu al-Aswad al-Duwali. The sources say he realized that the bare consonants weren't enough for the new converts. So he invented the very first vowel marks.
It was a simple but revolutionary technological leap. He instituted a system using red dots to indicate vowels.
Red dots?
Yeah, a red dot placed above the consonant meant A, a dot below meant I, and a dot in front meant U.
It's like putting training wheels on the alphabet.
He likely took the cue for this specific dot system from the Syrian Christians, who had developed a similar diacritical system for the Syriac language, but adding vowels was just the first basic step.
Right, they needed full rules.
The actual science of Arabic grammar, which is called al-Nah, was largely built not by the Arabs from the desert, but by non-Arabs living in the dense urban centers of Iraq.
Okay, I have to ask for clarification here. Why were non-Arabs the ones writing the rule books for the Arabic language? Shouldn't the native speakers be doing that?
Well, the native Arabs of the desert relied entirely on natural instinct. They just knew how to speak their language correctly through total immersion. They didn't need to analyze it.
Like how I don't know the formal rules of English grammar, I just know what sounds right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the non-Arabs, particularly the Persians and Syrians, who were inheriting this incredibly complex language, approached it scientifically. Many of them had a background in Hellenistic Greek-style logic and philosophy.
Yeah.
They applied that rigorous, systematic logic to the Arabic language.
They wanted to know the why.
Exactly. They wanted to find the underlying efficient cause. They weren't satisfied with just knowing that a word changed its ending. They wanted to uncover the mathematical logic and the universal rules that dictated why the ending changed.
And this intense desire to find the rules led to a massive, generational intellectual rivalry between two cities in Iraq, Basra and Kufa.
Oh, the rivalry was legendary.
The sources paint this as a fierce academic war. The Basra school loved strict rules. They approached language like theoretical physicists. They wanted to find the grand unifying analogies that governed all speech.
Right, and if a rule didn't fit.
Yeah, if a Bedouin used a word that didn't fit their mathematical rule, the Basra scholars considered the word a weird anomaly, a mistake.
But the Kufa school took the exact opposite, highly empirical approach.
How so?
They were more like observational astronomers. The scholars of Kufa practically made it their religion to collect the anomalies.
They liked the weird stuff.
If they found a weird exception to a grammatical rule, they didn't discard it. They obsessively recorded it and tried to construct entirely new, complex rules to justify the exception.
It's a fascinating divide in how humans process information. Do you force the data to fit the elegant theory, or do you make the theory messy to accommodate all the data?
It's a debate we still have in science today.
And to get this data, the sources say these urban scholars would literally leave their comfortable city lives and travel deep out into the harsh desert to live with the Bedouin tribes for months or years.
The Bedouin of the deep desert were viewed as the uncontaminated, pure source of the Arabic language, untainted by the cosmopolitan mixing of the cities.
So they go to the source.
The scholars went out like modern linguists or anthropologists recording a dying language. They sat by campfires, painstakingly writing down obscure vocabulary, poetry fragments, and specific grammatical usages.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Once these scholars scour the desert and collect tens of thousands of words, how do you organize them? You need a dictionary.
A huge dictionary.
But earlier, we mentioned the scholar Al-Khalil, the guy who listened to the blacksmith to figure out the poetry meters. Al-Khalil decides to write a dictionary, but he doesn't just write down the words he heard in alphabetical order.
No, he doesn't.
According to our notes, he calculated the theoretical permutations of the entire Arabic alphabet. I need you to explain this to me because it sounds like magic. How does Arabic word structure even allow for that?
To understand Al-Khalil's genius, we have to explain how Arabic works mechanically. Almost every word in Arabic is derived from a trilateral root, a three-letter combination of consonants.
Okay.
For example, the letters KTB carry the core concept of writing. From that single root, you derive kataba. He wrote kitab, book, maktab, desk, maktaba, library, katib, writer. The language is built on these foundational consonant blocks.
Okay, so the root is like the DNA, and the vowels you add tell you what specific part of the body you're looking at.
That's a perfect analogy. Al-Khalil, being a true polymath with a mathematical mind, realized the structural reality.
So what did he do?
So, instead of just making a list of words he happened to know, he mathematically multiplied the 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet by 27 to find all 756 possible two-letter combinations. Then he did the math for every possible three-letter root, four-letter root, and five-letter root. He generated every single possible combination of letters that could theoretically exist.
It's exactly like a modern computer scientist writing a brute force algorithm to generate every possible password combination.
Exactly.
He generated the massive matrix of possibilities first, and then what? Did he just leave it like that?
No, then he went through the matrix. He would look at a generated root and check his massive linguistic data. Is this root actually used by the Arabs to form words, or is it a dummy combination that the human mouth rejects?
Oh, I see.
He separated the real roots from the theoretical garbage.
That is just a staggering intellectual achievement. He mapped the absolute outer limits of the language, and he compiled all of this into a massive book called Kitab al-Ain.
But the organization.
Right. He didn't organize it alphabetically from A to Z. He organized it by the throat.
Yes, he sorted his dictionary based on phonetics, specifically the anatomical point of articulation in the human vocal tract.
I can't even picture that.
He started with the letters pronounced in the deepest part of the throat, which in Arabic is the letter ain, hence the title of the book. He moved up through the palate, the teeth, and ended with the letters pronounced at the very front of the lips.
It's brilliant from a physiological standpoint, but practically speaking, how do you even use that?
It wasn't easy.
If I'm a student and I want to look up a word, I have to first deconstruct the word to find its three-letter root, and then I have to sit there and whisper the letters to myself to figure out where they vibrate in my throat so I can find the right chapter.
Exactly. It was a masterpiece of phonetic theory, but as a user interface, it was a total nightmare. It was incredibly difficult for everyday scholars, let alone students, to navigate quickly.
Right. So centuries later, another scholar named Al-Jahari comes along and finally fixes the user interface problem.
He was a lifesaver for students.
He creates a monumental dictionary called the Siha. And his stroke of genius was organizing all these root words alphabetically, but by their last letter. Why is organizing a dictionary backward such a brilliant move?
Because you have to remember the cultural context of the society he was building this tool for. This is a society utterly obsessed with poetry.
And what do we learn about poetry? The qafiyah, the continuous rhyme at the end of every line.
Exactly. If you are a poet or a bureaucrat trying to write a highly stylized rhyming prose document and you have written 20 lines ending in a B, you desperately need another word that ends in B to finish your thought.
A normal dictionary doesn't help you there.
No, if a dictionary is organized by the first letter, it's useless to you. But Al-Jahari organizes it by the final letter. You just open the Seha to the B chapter and boom, you have an exhaustive list of every valid Arabic root that ends in the letter you need.
He didn't just write a dictionary. He invented the first comprehensive rhyming dictionary.
It perfectly served the technological needs of his society.
They had now successfully preserved the vocabulary, mathematically defined the grammar, and created the necessary reference tools. The Arabic language was secure. Which brings us to the next logical step.
Judging the art.
Right. Now that they have the rules, the grammar, and the dictionaries, how do they decide what actually makes a poem good? How did the science of literary criticism evolve?
Well, in the very early days, literary criticism was largely intuitive and rudimentary. As you mentioned earlier regarding the pre-Islamic era, arbiters would sit in the marketplaces, like the famous market of ukaz, and judge poetry contests based on instinct and immediate emotional impact.
Just a gut feeling.
The sources also mention early Islamic leaders acting as critics, like Caliph Umar praising the poet al-Nabiyya.
And Caliph Umar praised him specifically for avoiding redundant words and for only praising true, actual merit, rather than inventing lies. So early criticism was about efficiency and truthfulness.
Yes. But as the society grew more complex, and as the grammar was codified, criticism evolved into a rigorous academic discipline.
They started categorizing things.
You had scholars like Ibn Salam trying to objectively categorize poets into historical classes. You had al-Jahiz focusing on the physical performance of the orator and the psychological impact of speech on the listener.
Performance mattered too.
And you had Ibn Qutayba pushing back against the romanticization of the desert, arguing that ancient is not always better. He asserted that modern urban poets could rival the ancient Bedouins in pure craftsmanship.
But the ultimate critic, the guy who really cracked the code of why literature works, was a scholar named Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani in the 11th century.
Giorgiani was a visionary.
He was the one who moved criticism away from just pointing out nice words or smooth meters and dove straight into psychological analysis.
This raises an important question, one that Giorgiani dedicated his life to answering. If two poems use the exact same vocabulary, the same nouns, the same verbs, why is one poem brilliant and the other completely dull?
Yeah. Why does one verse move us to tears and the other leave us cold?
Right. If the words are identical, the magic has to be coming from somewhere else.
So what did he find?
Giorgiani proved that eloquence and literary beauty do not reside in the isolated words themselves. A word, sitting alone in a dictionary, has no inherent literary value.
Okay, that makes sense.
Beauty, he argued, lies entirely in their structure and syntax. It is how the words are mathematically and grammatically organized to map onto the sequence of meanings as they unfold in the human intellect.
It's not the bricks, it's the architecture.
Exactly. It is the construction, the invisible relationships between the words that creates the psychological impact.
He went incredibly deep into the psychology of aesthetics. The sources note he asked a fundamental question. Why does a metaphor please us? We use metaphors all the time, but why does the human brain enjoy them?
And his answer is so modern.
Right. He realized that the human soul inherently loves the intellectual leap of being transferred from the abstract to the concrete, or from the hidden to the visible. We love finding unexpected similarities between vastly different things.
It is essentially a cognitive puzzle. Giorgiani argued that when a poet presents a metaphor, they are offering the listener's brain a problem to solve.
And we like solving problems.
If the mental leap required to understand the metaphor is too easy, if it's a cliche, it's boring. The brain expends no effort and gets no satisfaction.
Like saying, he was as brave as a lion. My brain does zero work to decode that.
Precisely. But conversely, if the leap is too hard, if the poet's comparison is too convoluted or obscure, it becomes frustrating. The listener gives up.
Too much work.
Good poetry, true literary excellence, hits the sweet spot. It provides a cognitive puzzle that requires just enough intellectual effort to solve. When the listener's mind bridges the gap and connects the two images, it results in a sudden burst of psychological pleasure and intellectual satisfaction.
It's a Goldilocks zone of literature. Not too easy, not too hard. It's amazing that he was writing about the psychology of perception, cognition, and dopamine hits 1,000 years ago.
He was way ahead of his time.
Now, throughout this entire deep dive, we've been focusing heavily on the Arabic language. But as we noted during the Bohemian era, the Persian culture has been a massive ghost in the machine this whole time.
A huge influence.
Persian intellectuals were heavily involved in inventing the Arabic grammar rules. Persian Bohemians were transforming the themes of poetry in Baghdad. So we need to dedicate serious time to looking directly at the Persian literary tradition itself and how it achieved this incredible cultural synthesis.
The linguistic and cultural history of Iran is ancient, incredibly rich, and stubbornly resilient. The roots of the language stretch far back before the Islamic conquests.
How far back?
We are talking about the Avesta, which are the sacred texts of the ancient Zoroastrian religion. We are talking about Old Persian, the language carved into the monumental cuneiform inscriptions of the great Achaemenid kings like Cyrus and Darius.
So there's a deep imperial pride baked into the linguistic memory.
Yes. Over time, as the Persian Empire evolved and faced the shock of Alexander the Great's Greek conquests and later the massive Islamic conquests, the language evolved and split into distinct regional dialects.
And the main ones were.
The most notable split was between Dari in the east and Pahlavi in the west.
But when the initial shock of the Arab-Islamic conquest settled, and indigenous Muslim dynasties of Iranian origin like the Samanids began to rise to political power in the eastern provinces, something fascinating happened.
They didn't just go backwards?
No, they didn't revert to the ancient pre-Islamic languages, but they didn't entirely submit to Arabic either. Dari Persian became the undisputed literary language of the region, but it was a hybrid.
It was a masterful synthesis. Dari Persian absorbed the mathematical Arabic meters that Al-Khalil had codified, and it absorbed a massive amount of Arabic vocabulary, particularly religious, scientific, and philosophical terms.
So they took the Arab tools,
But the Persians didn't just copy the Arab forms.
Hmm.
They used this hybrid language to invent entirely new, distinctly Persian poetic structures.
The sources highlight two specific inventions. First is the Mathnawi.
The Masnawi, yes.
Unlike the Arabic Qasida, which forced you to use one single rhyme for an entire 100-line poem, the Mathnawi uses rhyming couplets. Every two lines rhyme with each other, and then you move to a new rhyme.
The Mathnawi form is revolutionary because it removes the structural bottleneck of the continuous kafiyya.
Because you only need to find one rhyming pair at a time.
Because the poet only has to sustain a rhyme for 2 lines at a time, it is the perfect vehicle for incredibly long, sprawling narrative epics and complex didactic poetry.
And the second invention is the rubai, the 4-line quatrain, which became globally famous through Omar Khayyam. But the most profound synthesis the Persians achieved wasn't just structural. It occurred in the realm of content.
Specifically with the rise of Sufism.
Yes, Islamic mysticism.
The sources are highly emphatic about this point. Islamic mysticism found its absolute greatest, most transcendent vehicle in the Persian poetic language.
Why Persian poetry specifically? Why didn't they just write theological essays in Arabic?
Because the mystics were dealing with highly dangerous concepts.
Dangerous to the state.
To the Orthodox scholars, they were preaching ideas of direct, experiential divine love, the annihilation of the ego, and ultimate spiritual union with God. To the strict, orthodox, literalist, religious scholars in the capital, these concepts sounded wildly unorthodox and frequently bordered on outright heresy.
Oh, and we know what happens to heretics.
To preach these ideas plainly in theological treatises was to invite persecution, exile, or execution.
So they needed a code, and they found it in the poetry. The text notes that poets like Rumi, Attar, and Sinai used intense, multi-layered symbolism.
They adopted the established secular language of the ghazal, the romantic love poetry, and the wine poetry of the Bohemians, but they infused it with entirely spiritual meanings.
So when they talk about getting drunk, it's not actually alcohol.
When a Sufi poet writes about becoming completely intoxicated on wine in a tavern, they are not talking about alcohol. The wine represents the overwhelming, ecstatic experience of divine love. The tavern is the spiritual gathering place. The beautiful, unattainable beloved is God himself.
It is a brilliant camouflage. It allowed them to communicate profound, universe-bending, philosophical and mystical truths under the safe, culturally acceptable veil of romantic poetry.
It gave them plausible deniability.
Right. If an Orthodox judge questioned them, they could just say, it's just a love poem. It created a cosmopolitan, spiritually rich poetry that easily transcended ethnic and political boundaries. The sources also mentioned another vital concept heavily promoted by these Persian mystics called futuwat.
Futuwat is a fascinating social phenomenon. It translates roughly to manliness or spiritual generosity.
I like to think of it as the Middle Eastern equivalent of European medieval chivalry, but infused with Sufi ethics.
That's a very good way to frame it.
It was a code of conduct for the common people in the cities, emphasizing courage, radical forgiveness, putting others before yourself, and moral rectitude. And this entire ethical system was taught, disseminated, and popularized through this beautiful, symbolic Persian poetry.
But Persian literature wasn't entirely focused on inward mysticism. It was also fiercely dedicated to historical memory and epic storytelling.
Back to the narratives.
We mentioned the Mathnawi earlier, and its capacity for long narratives. In the early 11th century, a poet named Ferdowsi utilized this form to write the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings.
It took him decades to write. It is a monumental epic that single-handedly revived and preserved the mythology, the folklore, and the history of pre-Islamic Iran.
A massive undertaking.
It spans from the mythical creation of the world all the way to the Arab conquest.
The Shahnameh cemented the Persian cultural identity within the broader Islamic world. It proved that a people could adopt a new religion while fiercely preserving their ancient cultural heritage and language. It remains one of the most outstanding and culturally significant epic poems in world history.
And this incredible Persian literary tradition didn't stay confined to the borders of modern-day Iran. The final section of our sources details how the Persian language traveled eastward into the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent.
As various dynasties expanded, and particularly under the immense power of the Mughal Empire, Persian became the official language of the court, of administration, and of high culture in India.
And this cultural transplantation created what scholars call the Indian school of Persian poetry.
It developed its own flavor.
Because it was physically separated from the Iranian homeland, it developed its own highly complex, distinct style. The text characterizes it by hyper-refined imagery, dense philosophical depth, and a conscious attempt to push the boundaries of metaphorical complexity.
It is a testament to the supreme flexibility and richness of the Persian language. It could adapt to the mystical asceticism of Rumi in Anatolia and to the opulent, complex court life of the Mughals in India.
It traveled everywhere.
This Indian school culminated in modern times with brilliant poets like Muhammad Iqbal, who used the ancient Persian forms to articulate modern philosophical and political realities.
Which brings up a final crucial point from the text.
No.
Almost every great Iranian philosopher man whose intellectual achievements shaped both the East and the West, like Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina, and Omar Khayyam, wrote poetry.
They weren't just scientists.
They didn't view poetry as just a frivolous emotional outlet. They used Persian verse to successfully synthesize and harmonize ancient Greek thought, like the logic of Aristotle and Plato, with Islamic theology.
They proved that poetry, when wielded with mastery, isn't just for expressing sentiment. It is a vital, precise tool for the highest levels of philosophical and scientific inquiry.
We have covered an absolutely immense amount of ground today. We started in the sandy, silent dunes of pre-Islamic Arabia, mapping the rhythm of a camel's gait, and ended in the philosophical courts of the Mughal Empire, mapping the nature of existence itself.
Quite a journey.
You, the listener, use language every single day. You use it to text your friends, to write emails for work, to argue about politics online, to tell someone you love them.
And what we've seen in this deep dive is that language is never just a static, passive tool that you simply pick up and use.
It's alive.
It is a living, breathing, constantly evolving organism.
Exactly. It survives the extreme deprivation of the desert. It adapts to entirely new moral universes when a new religion arrives. It gets mathematically dissected by grammarians like Al-Khalil, who calculated its absolute limits.
With outer edges of the alphabet.
Right. It gets psychologically analyzed by critics like Giorgiani, who figured out exactly how it triggers pleasure in the human brain. It absorbs foreign influences, creates new forms, and carries the weight of both fierce tribal blood feuds and transcendent, universe-bending mystical love.
It is the fundamental DNA of human civilization. It records our history, shapes our immediate thoughts, and ultimately defines our identity.
So what does this all mean? I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. We saw how the simple, physical, rhythmic beating of a camel's hooves across the desert sand could eventually, over centuries, give birth to Al-Khalil's mathematical dictionary and ultimately provide the framework for the transcendent mystical poetry of Rumi.
The environment shaped their minds.
It was the physical rhythm of their daily environment, subconsciously shaping the architecture of their minds. Think about your physical environment today. What new, entirely unprecedented poetic and linguistic forms are being subconsciously born right now in our minds, driven not by camel hooves, but by the rhythmic, mechanical tapping of our keyboards, the ping of notifications, and the endless, infinite scrolling algorithms of our digital existence.
That's a profound thought.
Thank you to our expert for this incredible journey, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Look closely at the words you use today. They hold the echoes of 1,000 years.